All right. So one response to the gap, again, I return to this gap between African Americans and other Americans, affirmative action.
Yes.
Which brings us back to your alma mater, Harvard. According to
I'll never live it down.
You'll never live it down, yes. You once told me that the principal benefit of a Harvard degree was never again having to be impressed by anybody who had a Harvard degree. Is that right?
Absolutely.
All right. So these are figures that were published in the Harvard Crimson, the student newspaper. In the Harvard class of 2019, these are the kids who will be graduating next June, the average SAT score for black students was 2149. By the way, these are all good scores, but for black students, 2149, white students, 2218, Asian students, 2300. Well, now that must be reasonable because it's taking place at Harvard, the seat of reason.
Well, that wasn't quite how I described it when I was there.
Affirmative action. Is that we ought not to be doing this?
You know, there are various laws and policies that benefit one group at the expense of another. But I think affirmative action has the distinction of being one that it harms everybody, though in different ways. And so there's a lot of evidence that there are black kids who have all the qualifications to be successes in college, who nevertheless are failures because they are systematically mismatched with institutions whose standards they don't meet, even though they may meet the standards of 80 or 90% of the colleges in America. I remember first aware of this when I was teaching at Cornell, and I found that half the black students at Cornell were on some kind of academic probation. And so I went over to the administration building and looked up the SATs of these students. The average black student at Cornell at that time scored at the 75th percentile.
Which is pretty darn good.
Yes. And so that means that in most colleges in this country, they would have no trouble, and many of them would be on the dean's list. But at Cornell, the average liberal arts student at that time was in the 99th percentile. And when you're teaching the students like that, you teach at a pace that most people of any race cannot keep up with. And it was always complained that I was assigning all kinds of reading. But heck, I'm teaching kids who are in the top 1%. They can keep up with the reading that I'm assigning.
So Cornell was taking very talented black kids and spending 4 years teaching them to feel inadequate.
Yes, and succeeding at that.
A couple quotations. These are both from the last affirmative action case to reach the Supreme Court, last big affirmative action case to reach the Supreme Court, 2003, Grutter versus Bollinger. Here's the majority opinion, which was written by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. Quote, "The court expects that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary." This upholding the use of, in a decision, 5-4 decision, upholding the use of racial preferences. Now, that's quotation one. Here's quotation two, Justice Clarence Thomas, in a dissent. Quote, "I believe that blacks can achieve in every avenue of American life without the meddling of university administrators. The court holds that racial discrimination in admissions should be given another 25 years. While I agree that in 25 years these practices will be illegal, they are illegal now." Close quote. So what do you do with the argument that Justice O'Connor, writing that majority opinion, there's something of the constrained vision there. Look, we have universities across the country are using these racial preferences as the basis of admission. The best we can hope to do is tell them they ought not to be doing it, that they should be developing other standards, and give them a clock. Is that a reasonable thing to do?
No, but it's a universal thing to do. I wrote a book about affirmative action. It was called Affirmative Action Around the World. And I made a couple of international trips at the expense of the Hoover Institution around the world to check on affirmative action. This is one of the most common arguments, and it's absolutely fallacious time and time again. The argument that like so much in the unconstrained vision, it assumes that we have a power that we do not have, cannot have, and never have had. Yeah, in England, there was a man named Scarman who was saying, "For the now, we must do this in order to." And in many countries, these programs are set up with an actual cutoff date. So it was set up in Malaysia with a cutoff date, I think, of around 1990, and in Pakistan, it was supposed to go for 10 years. None of those cutoff dates has meant a thing. These programs not only continue, they increase, they spread. So the idea that you can control the future because of these wonderful sounding words, I can't think of a country in the world where that's ever happened. In the case of Pakistan, they did have an actual cutoff date. And because the people in East Pakistan were, for whatever historical reason, way behind the people in West Pakistan. And so there's these preferences for the East Pakistanis. Now, before time for this thing to expire, the East Pakistanis seceded from Pakistan and formed a new nation of Bangladesh.
Bangladesh, right.
And the preferences continued right on because there were other groups that had been added to it. And so once you get the constituency, you can't say no to them.
I see.
It is an argument that has never worked out anywhere that I've been able to check.
All right. So Tom Sowell says no to the welfare state, no to affirmative action. What is to be done? And now you were kind enough to share with me the galleys of your forthcoming edition of Discrimination and Disparities. Let me give you a few quotations from some of the new chapter in that book. Quote, "The poverty rate among black married couples has been less than 10% every year since 1994. As far back as 1969, young black males whose homes included newspapers, magazines, and library cards had similar incomes to those of their white counterparts. Academic outcomes show a pattern of disparities similar to the pattern of disparities in the amount of time devoted to schoolwork. Apparently, lifestyle choices have consequences."
Yes.
Close quote. So this is the constrained vision once again. Welfare state, that's government, we don't rely on that. Affirmative action, government, we don't rely on that. We rely on hard work. We rely on the institution of marriage. That's correct?
Yes, in other words, these things, I don't think it's the marriage as such or the library cards as such. It's that there are lifestyle choices that have been made. And the comparison I made was between, if you look at the poverty rate among blacks, it was 22%, and among whites it was 11%. But among black married couples, it was 7.5%.
Right.
So it's not so they not only do better than blacks as a whole, they do better than whites as a whole. And so it's lifestyle choices. Similarly with the results in some of these more successful charter schools, that you have these kids not only meeting but exceeding the national standards in places like Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant in the South Bronx. And these are not kids who are skimming the cream. They're kids chosen by lottery. They don't even test them for ability. They don't even look at their academic records. They take them into the schools and they have hard work and they make it clear at the outset, and they don't tolerate a lot of nonsensical behavior. And these kids are doing incredibly.
So